Good morning, and sorry to be joining you from afar again. I don't know if Alyssa or Crystal has explained, but I am out in California dealing with some health issues with my parents, and so need to be out here. Hopefully, I'll be back in person next week. I believe I will. But one more time, a video lecture. Let me get things set up. It takes just a moment, and I am going to lecture yet again, and really for, I believe, the last time, about the Supreme Court. And the question I want to pose today, and I'm putting it quite provocatively, are we paying too much attention to the wrong coup attempt? And so my underlying claim here is, right, we've been focused very much on January 6th and what happened in the White House leading up to it, and whether or not there was an effort to orchestrate a disruption or a complete overthrowing of the Electoral College, peaceful transfer of power. And don't get me wrong, I think we should be very deeply concerned about that and about what it says about Donald Trump, the people surrounding him, but more generally about the Republican Party and their efforts to, in essence, ignore, whitewash, tell a lie or series of lies in a way that allows them to minimize or completely sweep under the rug what appears to be a criminal attack on the core of American constitutional democracy. So we are understandably focused on and outraged about what we are learning from the January 6th Commission and the way in which it is making absolutely clear in full public light exactly what happened, and about the seeming indifference of one of our two main political parties to the fact that the President of the United States attempted to orchestrate a coup from the White House. Having said all of that, let me then also say that that coup failed. And that doesn't mean that it isn't representative of an ongoing danger, the danger of Donald Trump, the danger of the MAGA wing of the Republican Party, which is increasingly the dominant wing, the wing that seems to have the best prospects for electoral success, especially in the 2024 presidential elections, though it's a long way away. Having said again, all of that, I want to suggest that there is another more successful, long-term, subtle effort to fundamentally alter the nature of electoral democracy and the power of the federal government to do what most Americans want it to do, that is underway and that is much more successful. It has been going on, I will suggest today, for over 20 years. But this year we are seeing it really take shape as an alternative center of power in the United States. And obviously, I'm referring to the Supreme Court, to what you might refer to as a constitutional coup, to the court not only removing from Americans rights central to their liberty, their autonomy, and their equality, but also the court increasingly putting its hand on the constitutional scale in ways that clearly favor one party over another. And let's be as clear as possible about this. 6 of the 9 justices on the Supreme Court are Republican appointees. 15 out of the last 19 members of the Supreme Court are Republican appointees. And unlike past eras of the court, the party that appoints the justice increasingly predicts, or almost entirely predicts in 2022, the way in which the justice is going to vote. And the Republican supermajority on the court is consistently doing things, reaching decisions that favor Republicans, not just in a policy agenda way, but in terms of their overall likelihood of electoral success. And this in an era when the Republican Party almost never wins the overall popular vote. So we have, right at the national level, 7 of the last 8 popular votes for the president have been gone for Democrats. We have states like Wisconsin in 2018 that all their statewide elected officials were Democrats, but a supermajority in the legislature is returned for Republicans because of partisan gerrymandering. And what happens in Wisconsin happens at a national level. The constitutional gerrymander of the Senate, which vastly overrepresents the least populous states, but also gerrymandering of congressional districts, makes it the case that the Republicans consistently lose the popular vote for Congress. More people vote for Democrats than do for Republicans, but Republicans win often a majority in either or both houses of Congress. And now I want to suggest to you the Supreme Court is doing things that make it more likely that Republicans are going to be able to continue to amplify minority support in order to secure majority control in Congress or the presidency or both the political branches. And so that's the focus today, is our constitutional structure stuck in a self-reinforcing feedback loop in which Republican legislatures confirm Republican appointees to the Supreme Court appointed by Republican presidents, and those Supreme Court justices then do things that make it either directly or indirectly more likely that Republicans will win office going forward. So that would be a much more subtle, much less visible, much less obviously criminal. It's not criminal unless it's a crime against democracy as opposed to a statutory crime, coup than the events of January 6th or the months leading up to January 6th. So let me start with the description of this, right? The risk we face is the self-reinforcing loop of amplified minority power. And we start with the idea that the Supreme Court is behaving more like the Republican Party that appointed it than perhaps any court in the history of the United States. And to be as clear as possible, throughout much of the 20th century, to begin with, the parties were less polarized. So there was less of a clear-cut divide in, among other things, the constitutional philosophy of the two parties. And so we sometimes see, right, Supreme Court justices getting 98 votes to confirm in the Senate, clear indication that the parties were not nearly as divided on their underlying understandings of the Constitution or the role of the court in a constitutional democracy. But even more than that, right? It was the case that one of the most liberal chief justices in the 20th century was appointed by a Republican. One of the most conservative members of the court in the 1990s was appointed by a Democrat. And so there wasn't an effort to vet, to test, to be sure that the person you were appointed to the court would adhere to a narrow judicial philosophy and ideological line that could be associated with a single party. That changed in this century. And the result is now that the Republican appointed judges, all six of them, justices, sorry, really do align very closely with Republican Party policy positions, and that it is clear in what they write in their decisions and the holdings that they generate, that their partisan views inform their judicial decision making. And this then is, I think, further complicated. It's rendered still more dangerous by the fact that the Republican Party is moving in an increasingly aggressively authoritarian direction, right? And that this is, in ways that I've tried to explain in the past, a reaction to the rapid transformation of the United States into a quote post-traditional society, which refers to the idea that we are no longer sufficiently integrated by a social consensus about the roles that we should play. What role is associated with being a man in America in the 21st century? What role is associated with being a woman? And whereas in the past, the social expectations that came with sex and gender were quite clear, those roles have been increasingly loosened, the normative expectations on them made much less specific, the ability of the individual to buck those expectations and carve a more individual way of life, a way of life that is not governed by shared or religiously grounded understandings. That has changed America dramatically, right? I've mentioned to you before that 20% of our children these days do not identify with the traditional gender that is assigned to them at birth. And that's just one indication. Women coming into the workforce, the fact that the majority of American children are born outside of traditional married heterosexual couples, right? And we could keep going in terms of the idea that gay marriage is now legal, et cetera, and so on. This is a fact. This is a cultural and social fact about American society. If you're like me, you tend to think it is primarily a sign of genuine normative progress. But you have to acknowledge, even if you admire this transformation, that for a certain segment of the American people, this is deeply threatening. And for that segment, and I want to say it's about a quarter to a third of the American population, the idea of forcefully reimposing tradition is extremely attractive. It responds to the so-called normative threat that the rate of social change represents for them. And the Republican Party, which is struggling in many respects to win national elections, and I want to be as clear as possible, the Republican Party at the level of the states, if you just measure the number of states that the Republican Party controls, primarily controls the governorship, controls the state legislature, is doing very well. But that is because it controls primarily the less populous states, which tend to be whiter, older, more conservative, and less well integrated into the global economy, doing less well economically. Those states tend to vote Republican, and they tend to vote Republican precisely because they see the Republican Party as a source for reassertion of tradition. And at the national stage, this means that the Republican Party is increasingly drawn to the use of authority to do what culture and voluntary behavior, religious belief, tradition used to do organically, not through government, but through other forms of social regulation, especially the socialization of children. And a party that seeks to impose more and more social and cultural norms, to do more to regulate the ethnic composition of a society in the name of preserving tradition, is a party that is going to be drawn to the use of authority. And so we are seeing this authoritarian drift in the Republican Party, and the mirroring of the Republican Party political agenda by the supermajority on the Supreme Court then, I think, gives pause for concern. Now, let's go a little bit more into the detail here. The worry in particular is that there is a self-reinforcing loop of amplified minority rule, insulated from challenge by a majority whose power is structurally weakened, right? And so we have talked about this before. I could revisit the data, but I think you know what I'm talking about at this point, right? There's a disproportionate representation of the less populous, less diverse, older states in both the Electoral College and the Senate. And that amplifies the power of the minority of the overall electorate and population of the United States over the composition of the Supreme Court. The president appoints, the Senate confirms, the president is chosen by the Electoral College, not the popular vote, right? So both George W. Bush and Donald Trump are in the presidency despite not having won the popular vote. And between them, they appoint 5 of the 6 justices in the current conservative supermajority, right? And similarly, their appointments are confirmed by the Senate. I've shown you in the Trump cases that the senators who vote to confirm the Trump appointees represent only a minority of the American population, but they get up to the 50 vote threshold necessary to confirm. And the result is that the Supreme Court is there because a party, the members of the Supreme Court now that are in the supermajority are there because a party that does not have majority support has put them there, and has put them there precisely to represent the alarm, the panic of the minority over the direction that the majority is taking in American politics. We add to that the fact that the current court, and it is a very aggressive court. I haven't talked with you about West Virginia v. EPA yet, the most recent decision, the decision that came out at the beginning of the week we're just concluding now. But again and again, overturning Roe v. Wade and the Dobbs decision, radicalizing Heller in the Bruin decision on gun rights, overturning, I shouldn't say overturning, well, yeah, disallowing a long-standing regulatory practice of the EPA via the Clean Air Act. Again and again, the Supreme Court has shown this term, the first term in which this supermajority of conservative justices has had full reign, that they are not going to be slow, gentle, incremental in their use of their majority power. Quite to the contrary, despite the fact that they must be aware that they represent only a minority of the population, the court is acting in a very unrestrained, aggressive way, overturning central precedents on controversial issues. And the issue here, let me continue, and I'll come back to this in a moment. The next issue has to do with the fact that we live in a society where we have great inequality. That inequality amplifies the power of the hyper wealthy. And we have a court, and we'll say more about this in a minute, that has opened the floodgates in Citizens United for money coming into our political process. And again, the result is that because that money tends to come primarily from the most wealthy and from corporations that have high concentrations of wealth, income, and social power, and because the Republican Party tends to favor the political agenda, a political agenda that is supported by the hyper wealthy, right? A agenda of reducing taxation, of decreasing regulation, the unleashing of money in American politics increases the likelihood that the Republican Party is going to succeed. There's interesting political science research that suggests that Citizens United has increased the representation in Congress of Republicans by at least 5%. Please note that a lot of times that's the difference between being in the minority and being in the majority. The court's invalidation of campaign finance reform limits the majority of Americans' capacity to insulate democracy from oligarchic tendencies that this inequality creates. And I want to be as clear as possible about this. A strong majority, again, 3/4 of the American population, favors campaign finance reform. And this is, again, not a transient partisan majority. This is a bipartisan majority that is quite stable. And oddly, perhaps, right, the Congress of the United States mustered the will over the course of a century. Please note that some of what Citizens United overturned was an approach to regulating money in politics that went back over a century. It wasn't just the McCain-Feingold more recent legislation. That there's been a stable approach to maintaining democratic equality rooted in an understanding of the Constitution, especially the 14th Amendment, that equality under the law includes some idea of equal opportunity to influence the outcome of elections, that letting the money of the very wealthy translate into unequal political influence and political power is anti-democratic. That's the idea that the Congress of the United States acted on several pieces of legislation, including the McCain-Feingold, and the Supreme Court simply substituted its judgment for the judgment of the Congress. No, money does not corrupt the political process in the way in which we're going to define corruption. And the consequence of this is, of course, that the playing field in American electoral politics is again tilted in the direction of the Republican Party. Similarly, the court's invalidation of voting rights legislation makes ballot access restrictions a further tool of amplified minority power? I want to be as clear as possible, right? The writing is on the wall. We look at the outcomes in the Georgia elections, and it's not just Georgia, it's increasingly Texas, it's already Arizona. Perhaps in the future it will be Florida. These are states that have been in the past relatively reliably conservative states, but as they have diversified, as large numbers of African Americans and Latinos have moved to these states, as the concentration of urban populations and suburban populations have experienced greater diversity, the electorate as a whole is moving in a more democratic direction. How does the Republican Party cope with this underlying shift in the electorate? One possibility would be that they meet the electorate halfway. That is to say, they generate policies that appeal to a more diverse, somewhat more liberal, less traditional electorate. But that is, in essence, a non-starter for the Republican Party in this decade, at least, because their core constituents are hostile to trying to reconstitute the party as a more inclusive 21st century conservative party. And so, as opposed to that, the Republican Party in many states has started to try to aggressively gerrymander, talk about that in a moment, but also try to make it more difficult for the populations that are likely to vote Democratic to vote, right? To restrict access to the ballot selectively so that there's a partisan advantage in the way in which elections are conducted. Needless to say, this is incompatible with a core commitment to the kind of justice, fairness, equal influence that is essential to democratic justice, and yet the court has allowed this and appears poised to continue to allow this. Partisan gerrymandering further allows the Republican Party to translate minority support into majority power. And again, the court has made critical decisions allowing this. Let me go a little bit into the details here, right? And I just want to talk about the relevant cases to give you a sense of what has been a 20 plus year process of the court remaking the rules of democracy in a way that favors one party over another, where only justices appointed by that party have favored these decisions. At this level, it seems quite naked, frankly, and it disturbs me to have to say that, but I think what we have witnessed the last couple of weeks, in a sense, allows no ambiguity, no doubt about the partisan direction the Supreme Court is moving in. So we start with Bush v. Gore, and I've arrayed these decisions in chronological order. That's the decision, of course, that awarded the presidential election of 2000 to George W. Bush. Not that it's entirely clear that Bush wouldn't have won, right? He might very well have won even without the Supreme Court putting its hand on the scale, but it's a very odd decision. It's a decision that many people look at and have trouble seeing the coherence of. A court that had often favored state sovereignty overturns Florida's decision to continue counting its ballots on a peculiar interpretation of equal due process, that what Florida is doing is unfair to other states. Florida getting an accurate vote count is unfair to Georgia. It's frankly a very peculiar decision. It awards the presidency to George W. Bush. George W. Bush eventually appoints two of the Supreme Court justices, now in the supermajority on the court, right? And so you see the court shapes the outcome of an election. The outcome of the election shapes the composition of the court. Next big decision here, a decade later, Citizens United versus the FEC, holding that corporate speech is unrestricted by, or cannot be restricted by, campaign finance reform, because corporations have the same right as people under the First Amendment, using a very peculiar and narrow definition of corruption, again, with the Supreme Court substituting its judgment about what constitutes corruption for Congress's judgment. Shelby County v. Holder is the decision that guts critical provisions of the Voting Rights Act. Please note that the Voting Rights Act goes back to the middle of the 1960s, but had been reauthorized by Congress twice by large majorities, including quite recently before it was overturned by the Holder decision. And in the Holder decision, Chief Justice John Roberts essentially says the South is no longer racist in the way that it used to be. Again, the court substituting its judgment for the judgment of the political branches on an issue where it has no superior expertise. It's one thing to say, when it comes to the interpretation of the Constitution, that this is what the Supreme Court is specialized in. But when it comes to the meaning of how money corrupts the political process, Citizens United, or the question of whether or not certain states that had been targeted for heightened scrutiny, requiring pre-approval from the Justice Department when it makes decisions about elections, whether those states still require that scrutiny when Congress has said they do, the Supreme Court again simply substitutes its decision. I didn't put the year on Janus. I apologize for that. That's 2018, I believe. But the Janus decision is the next big decision here. And here the Supreme Court holds that mandatory membership in public unions is a violation of the First Amendment. This is the decision that leads Justice Elena Kagan to write a dissent in which she worries that the Supreme Court has become simply 9 rulers in robes, that it is weaponizing the First Amendment to accomplish its political ends. And the result of this decision is to overturn a previous Supreme Court decision, which I think was a more balanced decision, in which the justices had said, well, for the purposes of bargaining, negotiating contracts, it is important that unions be able to constitute union shops, including with governmental employees. But that doesn't mean that they have to give to the unions political operations, right? And so creating a differential regime in which membership and support for bargaining is mandatory, but support for political activities is voluntary. Janus throws that all out and says, no, nobody can be forced to be in a union. And the result has been dramatically weakened governmental employee unions, which has further fed back into the political process one of the few remaining countervailing forces after Citizens United allows all this corporate money into politics is union organizing. This is making it more difficult for unions to organize. Russo versus Common Cause. This may be new to you. This is a relatively recent decision, only 3 years ago. And this is a decision that says basically the federal judiciary is not going to get involved in partisan gerrymandering. Up until the Russo decision, the Supreme Court had been kind of equivocating about partisan gerrymandering, saying, well, we don't quite have a standard yet, but if it gets too bad, we might do something about it. And Russo, Chief Justice John Roberts just said, no, this is non-judiciable. This is not something that the Supreme Court can do anything about. And that green lights radical partisan gerrymandering. The court is not going to supervise it no matter how bad it gets. Then there's the decision this term. And I want to pay attention to the new decision in West Virginia versus the EPA, because it seems to really put in the crosshairs the regulatory capacity of the federal government. This is a clean air regulation. Clean water regulations are likely to be on the docket next term, but food and consumer product and medicine and pharmaceutical regulations, transportation regulations, all seem potentially and in danger given this holding. The holding is that when a regulation is going to have major impacts on the economy or society, Congress cannot delegate general power like it did to the EPA and the Clean Air Act, saying we want you to adopt the best regulations to protect clean air. Congress has to generate new legislation specifically enabling the kind of regulation that the executive agency is then going to impose. And the Supreme Court must know, because they live in 21st century America, even though they like to pretend they still occupy the 18th century, that our congressional process, our legislative process is so paralyzed that it's extraordinarily unlikely that the court is going to be able, Congress is going to be able to continuously generate new regulations. The result is going to be then that the federal government's role in our society is going to be radically diminished. Things that many of us simply take for granted that our government is going to do for us, it will no longer be capable of doing. And the result of this, and I'll just speak very briefly about this today, is that the help that many of us have hoped that the federal government is going to provide us, the help in making sure that our consumer products, our medicine, are safe, that our air and water are not too polluted, is not going to be available going forward. And I think in basic respects, this then is compounding what has already occurred in terms of the growth of inequality, the sense of vulnerability of many Americans. And that kind of resentment and grievance is again being articulated better by the Republican Party. There's a clear, not only policy slant, but partisan slant, even to a seemingly technical administrative law decision. Finally, the Supreme Court has just announced that next term it will hear a case, Moore v. Harper, which raises an issue coming out of North Carolina about whether or not courts can be involved in election disputes, in arbitrating and ultimately adjudicating the question of whether or not the legislature has fairly districted, right? And what we see in North Carolina is, even though the national Supreme Court won't consider gerrymandering or partisan districting in terms of its underlying fairness, the court in North Carolina said this map is too tilted in the direction of one party, threw it out. And now North Carolina is suing under the federal constitution to say no. The Constitution says that legislatures get to regulate elections, not courts, state legislatures. And so this would create a situation in which state legislatures, partisan institutions, are the sole arbiters of all things to do with the way in which elections are organized at the state level. We don't know yet how this decision will turn out, but I have to tell you, I am deeply concerned that it will be another in this string of decisions that have tilted the playing field in the United States, in our political process, in our democratic elections, in favor of one party, a party that, without the assistance of gaming the electoral process, of creating difficult access for ballots for certain groups in certain areas, of dividing districts to make them hyper advantageous to one party, allowing money into politics. Without all of that, that party, the Republican Party, would not be doing very well in American elections. The Supreme Court appears to be increasingly putting its finger on the scale for the assistance of one party. This is, I think, a deeply concerning development, because if this continues, then of course that party continues to have the capacity to shape the court, and we're in a self-reinforcing loop. We are stuck here. This is an efficient, dangerous method for taking critical political decisions out of the hands of the majority of Americans. This is the coup we should be worried about as much as what transpired on January 6th. I do look forward to being back there in person with you next week. I'm glad we've got the chance to communicate from afar today. Take care, be well, and I will see you next week, everybody. Bye-bye.